Okay, I guess I'll act as the MC. They gave us a little room because there are two economists today, and that's almost anathema here at the Left Forum. So they have Michael Perelman and myself. And fortunately, the saving grace is we do have a political theorist. And it's sort of an oxymoron having Bertell and me here, because Bertell's going to talk about the laws of motion, and as you know, the Nobel Prizes in economics are given for mathematical proof that there isn't any motion, that everything is self-stabilizing and it all goes back to normal. So somehow they put us on the same program, and they must have realized that and hoped that nobody would come to hear us give these two contrasting pictures of how the economy doesn't work. So we're going to begin with the bright spot with Bertell talking about the laws of motion.
I promised myself that the next time I would give a talk at John Jay, I would start by quoting the real John Jay. And just in case there's a few people in the audience who don't know what is one of my very favorite quotations. So this is during the Constitutional Convention in 1787. John Jay, one of the delegates, said during the convention, quote, "Those who own the country ought to rule it. Those who own the country ought to rule it." Well, he obviously succeeded very well, and that's why we have such a lovely building, such a lovely location to discuss, well, what can we do about that situation? I take it everyone here knows that they are moving, even when they are sitting perfectly still. Have you ever wondered how many ways in which you are moving? And moving implies, of course, changing in one way or another at some pace, and for better or worse, often both. We all live on the planet, and of course the planet is moving in various ways, which seem to be strange, and it's hard to understand how that can all happen at the same time, to move in so many directions and ways. But this is what's happening with the planet, and we have, of course, learned a great deal about these movements, which are also our movements, because we are on the planet. We're closer to the sun. The sun, along with its planets, go around its galaxy, which is our galaxy, and the galaxy is moving toward what some astronomers call the Great Attractor, cluster of galaxies, and all galaxies, including that cluster, are moving away from the Big Bang, where it's supposedly all started some 15 million years ago. Our bodies are places where all kinds of movements are going on, and I won't go through this for the body or for other subjects. Everything is moving in some way or another. No surprise then, of course, that Marx should be concerned with the movement, the particular movements that occur in the society in which he lived, in which he saw growing and developing into a global society. And this is what he was talking about when that is the specific movements of capitalism, when he, in his preface to Volume 1 of Capital, he wrote, and I never saw this phrase elsewhere in Marx. He wrote, "My main aim in this work is to lay bare the law of motion of modern society," by which he meant capitalism. To lay bare the law of motion of modern society. Well, that's mysterious. And reading Capital, for most people, it doesn't really help them understand what that law of motion is. What kind of motion is he talking about? You might call it a law. And what exactly is its importance? He talks about so many things. And it remains, I think, not altogether clear, even for most Marxists, just what exactly, why exactly talk about what he proceeds to do, and not only in volume 1, because he intended to publish the other volumes which Engels brought out, and even a lot of the materials that were eventually brought out by Kautsky after Engels died. There remains something of a mystery. What exactly is the law of motion in all this? Now, the first problem one encounters in trying to clarify this is that capitalism is so big, so complex, and the interactions and changes that occur in it appear to come from so many different places and have such a variety of both direct and indirect effects on each other, that it's very hard not to include too much or too little in establishing our main object of study, this law of motion of modern society. But this is just what I'm going to try to do here before presenting the implications for this interpretation of what the law of motion is all about, capitalism is all about, for crisis, and particularly periodic crises. Another way of putting my problem is what is distinctively capitalist in capitalist society? The society, I think, here includes the society in which we live. It includes more than one law of motion, and Marx is fixing on one as being most important for the subject that he is most concerned about. Our society, as I understand it, and as I understand Marx, contains five distinctive kinds of motion. Probably more, but for Marx, these were the 5 which were most important. And among them, we'll see the capitalist motion, the motion that's distinctive of capitalism, is the most important. But let's get some of the others out of the way, because I think it's terribly important in grasping what the capitalist one is to see what the others are, because they all coexist. And that means they interact to some degree and overlap to some degree and affect each other to some degree. And one of the big problems, because they all coexist within capitalism, is that people trying to understand what Marx is talking about when he's discussing the law of motion of the capitalist part of our society, they tend to include elements which come from some of these other laws of motion, and that keeps people from getting a clear fix on the capitalist law of motion, and having, coming out of that, having a better understanding of how they can deal with it, as well as, of course, what must be done. So what's the first and the oldest? That's the result of the interaction between all the qualities that set us apart as human beings, part of the human condition. Our instincts as part of this species called human, our powers, our drives, etc., and they all remain part of what might be called, and is called by many, human nature. And they all interact with each other and have from the beginning of our species, which goes back some hundreds of thousands of years. And they still exist today, though they've been affected and altered in terms of how they're realized by a lot that has happened since. The second kind of motion got underway 5,000 to 10,000 years ago particularly in Europe, but also in parts of Asia like China and India, with the beginnings of class society. Class society based on the division of labor, rather than everybody contributing to producing what the community needed in pre-class society. So there's now a division of labor, and with this, an unequal participation of people in labor and in the distribution of the fruits of labor. And the appearance, alongside of all this, of a ruling class, but also of the beginnings of an armed force, and an accompanying ideology, both of them there to secure the rule of the people who have become the ruling class in a class society. Now these developments, which did not occur all at once, but these developments, once they began, because they functioned together and bolstered and pushed forward each other, these developments evolved and produced a distinctive movement whose more general forms and effects continue with us today. And the best known class societies being feudalism, slave society, feudalism, and capitalism, understood now in what it has in common with these other class societies. However, capitalism has developed so fast. A new development occurs in capitalism. I won't bother to give you the main characteristics. That'll come out later in my talk, and also from some of the other speakers. But a number of new developments occurred, which were different than what had occurred in earlier times, even at the beginnings of, let's say, capitalism as it emerged out of feudalism. And these new developments moved so quickly ahead and developed so many other new developments to create the system of capitalism, all of which were interacting. And it's this interaction between the functions which are distinctive of each of these systems which create a law of motion, which contributes both to the solidity of the system, to how it works, how efficient it works, and how quickly it develops, and of course how different groups of people within it are affected. We're going to come back to this, of course. This is the one that Marx was concerned with, and its beginnings, you know, is up for dispute, and there's a lot of discussion as to did capitalism begin 300 years ago, or 4 or 5, and where did it begin first? Well, I think a useful figure is that it began somewhere as a system, something like 300 to 500 years ago, particularly and most importantly in England, though elements that became essential to the workings of capitalism appeared earlier, and some of them much earlier in places like Holland and, of course, some of the Italian city-states. But some of them even go back earlier than that, some of the elements which became integrated into what we now call capitalism. Fourth, capitalism has developed so quickly, especially in the last 30 to 50 years. But when I say 30 to 50 years, I'm also thinking of what was the last 30 to 50 years for Karl Marx. That a fourth kind of motion, which is distinctive to a large degree from capitalism, which I'm going to be calling capitalism in general, which is distinctive from capitalism in general, understood primarily in terms of the structures, what many people call the structures of capitalism, but I'm a little uncomfortable with the term because it's a little too static. I mean, even the structures are evolving. This new movement characterizes the developments, the most recent developments that have occurred in capitalism, which rather quickly, through their connections, create a kind of new stage with a distinctive movement. I'm thinking, let's say, of the most recent period, and I've dubbed this modern capitalism. But it isn't really a part of the law of motion that is general to the whole of capitalism, including the modern period. But there's a new something which now has to be added to this law of motion of capitalism in general. In the most recent period, it includes things like globalization, which occurred earlier, I know, to a large degree, but how quickly and the forms that it's taken, a lot of them particularly important. The same with the more important role that finance plays both in capitalism and in government. The automation. Again, the technology has existed earlier, but a quantity-quality change has occurred, and I won't go into detail of what new and different is suggested by automation, but I believe there is something new and different, and together with automation, the reforms, the changes made to containers of various sorts, and the effect that that's had on this, on the movement of goods across oceans, which is effect which comes into this this law of motion, which I'm calling this form of motion, which I'm calling modern capitalism. And finally, the fifth kind of motion is what occurs in the unique characteristics and conditions and events reported in the media, where everything and everyone has a proper name. Here, the changes, like in the other cases, of a certain kind are everywhere. Again, I'm sorry. I have another 10 minutes.
Maybe 5 more minutes.
What?
You're just about out of 5 more minutes. I'll take 7. Okay.
Could you repeat number 5?
Number 5 is the unique. The unique. Again, what appears in the daily press, which is constantly changing, but it's a motion, and it has certain rules and certain you can generalize about it. Now, the most common errors in treating these different laws of motion are the following, and I can only list them, and we can maybe talk about some of them later on. First of all, running 2 or more of them together, and I indicated that was a problem, if one doesn't set them out first to see how different they are, and to treat them for certain purposes as different, so as to be able to focus on what's special about them. So people don't do that because they don't break down these different law motions in this way. And Marx didn't do this explicitly, but I can show, if you give me another week, I can show that this is in fact how he deals with the topics that come into his works, though by far the most important is capitalism in general. A second problem is that people tend to neglect the different appearances and essences which you find in each of these laws of motion, so that one can lay them out both in terms of the appearances, and you know, appearance, the difference between appearance and essence plays a big role in Marx's analysis, so anything and everything, what you can see directly, but also what you have to find by investigating relationships of different kinds over time to get a hold of the movement which occurs. And in Capital and his other published works, there's a lot of both, but I would say more of discussion of appearances, and in the unpublished writings, the 44 manuscripts of Goodrissa, much more of what are an analysis of the same subject matter, but focusing more on its essences, on its relationships, on how it's evolved. A third problem comes from omitting or underplaying the importance of or the internal relations of the organic motion and of the historical motions, which together, through their interaction, make up the law of motion of all of these levels, not just capitalism. So really, when Marx talks about the law of motion of capitalism, he's integrating 2 different, what seem like different motions, the organic, which goes on inside capitalism at any moment of time, and out of these other levels as well, and the historical motion, how it evolved from whatever it was through stages to what it is now and where it seems to be going. And this is a very important part of understanding all of these laws of motion, particularly capitalism, and this is neglected by most people. So they tend to treat one or the other, and not enough time to see both with their obvious and important interaction. Fourth, omitting error that people make in in understanding and therefore being able to study the law of motion of capitalism is they omit or underplay the interaction between the material, the human, and the ideational, whether reflecting the real world, reality of the world, or being ideology, which means a distortion of what's out there. But all those things are part of every law of motion and are interacting and are seldom all treated when people focus on any one of them. And our problem is the problems that would raise for understanding the law of motion of capitalism. And finally, omitting and underplaying the internal relation between theory and practice, which is also part of every law of motion. And one of the biggest problems in understanding theory and practice of Marxists is not to see them as they're internally related, how you can find each of them inside the other because they have been interacting in certain ways, related, of course, to classes and class interests, but mostly they're treated as separately, and this causes distortions in both of them. I'll have to finish, apparently, and so I'm going to try to say a few words about how this affects understanding about crisis. Crisis, for Marx, is not only why crises occur periodically in capitalism for roughly the last 200 plus years, but also how crisis becomes possible. And so that would be, that is to say, at the core of what Marxist economics is about, is this attempt to get at how it works so as to produce periodic crises. But part of his explanation of crisis is what makes crisis possible. And in other words, having to do with the beginnings of some kind of capital, some kind of money, some kind of labor, and of course some kind of those three crucial features of capitalism have all emerged in pre-capitalist society to some degree. And that didn't produce crisis, but that laid the basis for what was then later, when all those processes became much more developed and their interaction between them became more important to all of them and to the rest of society, they would produce crisis. And also for understanding crisis, and this is where the law of motion of capitalism becomes important, is to see that there's, as part of Marxist theory of crisis, there is also an attempt to get at what kinds of things have triggered and could trigger an economic crisis. Because the discussion of what makes crisis inevitable deals with how crisis is becoming more likely given the problems of capitalism, given basically its contradictions. And as those contradictions are becoming more and more difficult for them to continue on the path that they've been following, that a resolution seems to be close. But the resolution usually results from a triggering event or condition of some sort. And when Marx talks about different crises which had already occurred, he points to a bad harvest, a war, a collapse of an important bank, and a few other things which can, and notice they're not all economic conditions or economic functions which can trigger the crisis because the system's so ripe for one. Now that comes from modern capitalism. And so it's, I think, wrong to overdo the attention one is spending on modern capitalism or on pre-capitalism for getting a clear fix on what is the law of motion of capitalism. But at the same time, one could see how the interaction between what came before capitalism really gets going in making crisis possible and certain developments which occur after modern capitalism has included also the stage that I've referred to after capitalism in general has included the stage of modern capitalism, which isn't so involved in the law of motion of capitalism in general, but it is involved often in producing that triggering event, So the theory of crisis requires, finally, a real laser-like focus on the law of motion of capitalism in general, and for that you've got to separate out these other levels, if you like, of generality, all of which are overlapping and interacting in the same society. But the levels of the particular laws of motion are different. But to deal with some of the problems, crisis being maybe the best example, you've got to introduce them both in terms of getting what goes into a crisis, making a crisis possible, because that's where it occurs. And you've got to introduce the modern stage of capitalism and looking for what triggers it. And then you're in a position to not only understand the whole system of capitalism in its distinctive particularity, but also, and this is my final word, but also to see that the best explanation for the crisis then is not one part of an interconnection or a contradiction in one section of what's going on, one part of this larger law of motion, but to see that they are all partial and in an important way correct beginnings of an explanation whose full truth lies in recognizing that it is capitalism itself, the totality of capitalism, how it works as a system, which is the cause of crisis within capitalism. Capitalism includes periodic crises and includes the occurrence of these crises. And this is, in a way, my accepting all the different, or most of the different interpretations that Marxist economists argue about as to what causes crisis, and saying they're all right, they're part of the truth. They're looking at a certain piece from a certain angle and limiting the interconnections. They don't go further into the interconnections. If they did, they'd see that and therefore, if you don't want the terrible problems that we now have, much worse in capitalism than ever before, we can't settle on reforms. And we can't talk about capitalism in a way which suggests that reforms will do some good, but have to focus on the need for a communist revolution to get rid of capitalism, lock, stock, and barrel, to arrive at the changes which we need, not just as workers and socialists, but as human beings.
My name is Michael Perelman. I'd like to start with a discussion, a short, brief discussion of Marx's harshest critic. His name was Karl Marx. The day he received his proofs of capital.
Louder.
Okay, that's a fault I have. I don't speak that loudly.
Yeah, but we can't hear a thing.
But you can hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Marx's harshest critic was Marx, because the day he got his proof sheets from Capital, he writes to Engels. He says, have you read Balzac's short story, The Exhibition? Well, the short story, The Exhibition, was about a very famous painter who had spent 10 years, and people were waiting. What was his painting going to be? How good was it going to be? He unveils it, and everybody's aghast. He's painted over it so many times that nobody can make a heads or tail of what the painting is, let alone whether it's good or not. And I think Marx understood that what he wrote was so kaleidoscopic, so deep, so intense, it would be very, very difficult to understand. Then we get to the idea of the laws of motion. The problem with the laws of motion is a very good idea, but it creates a temptation where academic people want to reduce Marx down to some sort of algebra. How many hours have been wasted trying to solve the transformation problem? How many people have tried to figure out the mathematical explanation for the law of falling rate of profit? Of course, Marx never had a law of falling rate of profit, but Marxists do. And they waste their time and our time on these proofs. He had tendencies, and that's fine. But it wasn't a law that can command people's attention to mathematize economics. One interesting element of the law of motion of Marx is a concept that he wrote fairly early, and he called it the mortal leap. How many people have heard of the mortal leap? It's one of the most interesting parts of Karl Marx, and nobody writes about it, nobody talks about it, the mortal leap. And what he's talking about are breaks in the circulation of capital. And he uses a wonderful example. Charles Babbage, who created, well, he did the blueprints for the first computer in the world, and then later in the 20th century it was actually built on his blueprints. He spent years and years, because to have this computer required precise equipment, precise manufacturing. So he became an expert in manufacturing and wrote a book on it. Terrific book. And one of the things he mentioned was the story of a machine for making patent nets. I don't know what a patent net is, but I think it's for stockings. It costs 1,200 pounds for one of these machines. 2 years later, the same machine sold for 60 pounds. Technical change. Same as we saw in computers. When they first started coming out, it was $10,000 for a computer, and then it was down to 1,000, and then the new one would come out, it would be 900. Rapid technological change, which is at the core of capitalism. And Marx talks about the real capitalist method, but it undermined capitalism. After the Civil War, the war contracts gave manufacturers a demand to create large amounts of commodities. Then they developed better technology, and what happened was the machinery and manufacturing was suffering the same effect as Babbage was talking about. The most famous example was Andrew Carnegie built a mill. It was 3 months old. He heard about a way of improving the technology. He had Schwab, I forget what his first, Charles Schwab, I think it was, tear down the machine, tear down the factory, start all over. What this meant was a rapid devalorization of capital. And this happened so much that prices are falling, and big corporations were unable to pay off their debts. So you had a debt depression and an overproduction depression and an overinvestment depression. It was called the Great Depression. It starts in 1873. Fortunately, people in the United States knew enough about economics that they realized how you get out of a depression. War. Spanish-American War. That's real economics. Okay. The problem was the industrialists realized that this was going to happen over and over again, and they said no more. So they got permission to create these cartels, these great conglomerates, to minimize competition. But of course, when you minimize competition, you minimize the vitality of capitalism, where you get something where the big three automobile producers, lacking any competition. You remember Henry Ford saying when the Volkswagen started coming in, mini cars mean mini profits, mean we've got the whole game. And then you had cars competing in how good their drink holders were, but without any real kind of competitive excellence. It didn't exist. And then when the Japanese came in, and our smart economists figured that out too. The Japanese were taking over the American automobile industry, so Ronald Reagan told the Japanese that it would be in their best interest to voluntarily means we have the biggest army in the world, cut back on your automobile production. And they did. What would you do if you could only sell a few cars? Well, you'd want to make them as good and as expensive as possible. And they tore up the American automobile industry. The whole thing is a mess. So I wanted, this idea of the mortal leap is so important. The idea was almost copied by J.R. Hicks, who said the investment in long-lived capital, investor in long-lived capital becomes hostage to the future. Now all this is interesting because we, all of us good economists, know that markets are efficient, and capitalists know how to allocate capital efficiently, and therefore you don't have the problem that Andrew Carnegie faced, or the people who brought the patent that, well, no, it doesn't work that way. We get out the problem of uncertainty because we say every good capitalist has a probability distribution in his mind. And investing is as clear as betting on a game of dice where you know how many outcomes there can be. And they never take that. The other part is people get so flared up with the possibility of these new technologies, .com and the cable that was live. Someone claimed that the cable went as far as someone claimed that the cable went as far as the sun. I'm sure that's not true, but it is true that it went as far as the moon and back several times. And most of it is black. It's never been turned on, and if it were turned on, there's probably better cable now. It'd be worthless. We have the laws of motion, but the most interesting part that you get out of Marx is, along with these laws of motion, you have these anarchies of motion. And the market, according to Marx, is anarchic. And that anarchic means that big problems are made. One of the delightful things of our times is that hedge fund after hedge fund is going belly up, because they all knew that energy and other commodities are going to go up. It's a killing. And then they get burned. But how could they get burned? Because capitalism is so efficient. It has, as Hayek would tell us, it has the ability to take all existing knowledge and compress it into a price, which gives us the exact knowledge of the commodity you're talking about. Or maybe it doesn't. So this is where we have. Now, this guy Marx, what I started out, and both these people told me I was wrong to do it, but I'm going to put in a little bit anyway, is how Marx saved America. You laugh. It sounds absurd. How did Marx save America? Well, in 1848, there's a big uprising all over Europe, and Marx is running the paper which is most influential and most read in Germany. And he's very careful. He publishes 2 editions every day, one for the censor and one for the public. After a while, according to the laws of motion of capitalism, he knew he was going to get shut down. So he publishes a last edition with big red ink, no more taxes. So here's Marx almost anticipating the Republican Party of today. He makes such a strong figure in 1848 as a newspaper editor that Charles Henry Dana comes to meet him and has him made into the chief correspondent of the New York Tribune. New York Tribune was the Wall Street Journal or the Fox News of the day. It was the mouthpiece of the Republican Party. And he is there until the Civil War starts. But Marx was key in preventing the North from losing the Civil War. When you go to Mount Rushmore, I'm sorry to say that the bust of Karl Marx has not been put up yet, but I'm sure it will be. Because how did Karl Marx, this poor German refugee, what did he do? What did he do? Well, he was living in England. And during the war, the North cut off trade with the South. So there was in England something called the cotton famine. And workers are dying all over the place of cholera because their health is too poor because they can't eat well. And this cotton famine is raising hell in England. It's a crisis. It's not predicted by the laws of motion, but it's a crisis, and you can see where it would come from. It would be almost as if the United States got cut off from oil. before fracking. While in England, Marx knows that England is going to come on the side of the Confederacy. He calls a meeting of the International Working Men's Association, and they say, do not support slavery. John Quincy Adams, who had been an ambassador to London, credited Marx with saving the United States. Senator Hoare, he doesn't spell his name the way a senator should. He doesn't have a W in front of it. It's just H-O-A-R-E. George Frisbee Hoare, it's a nice middle name for Americans. George Frisbee Hoare gave this long, long speech in the Senate talking about how important this meeting was. There was a rival meeting, and I haven't heard anything about its effect. It was created by John Stuart Mill. It was Marxist that did it. Oh, Marx also got a letter from Abraham Lincoln's private secretary. In addition, regarding Abraham Lincoln, when 1848 is finally crushed, lots of Germans come over, the 48ers, to the United States, and they settle in Texas, where Marx was thinking of emigrating to. Can you imagine? Karl Marx in Texas? That would have saved the United States. And a lot went into Oklahoma, and then Ohio and Indiana. And the Ohio German refugees were crucial in giving the Republican nomination to Abraham Lincoln. So here's this guy, he really doesn't eat babies for breakfast, who saved the United States of America, and very few people had even taken notice of that. So let's get back to this moral leap. That is, investment is into uncertainty, especially for long-term, long-lived investment. And when I read the Marxist literature, I read very little about constant capital, except for the fact that it doesn't create value. And it's very, very important. Because when people are investing in long-lived capital, mostly they're seeing what other people are doing, which means you're probably going to get the overreaction that you got during the dot-com boom. I'm sorry. Give me something more solid, and I'll try to keep it up. It's a problem.
I'm hard of hearing. It's not your...
I am too, so I should be sympathetic, but I'm sorry, my voice trails off. Okay. So anyway, a lot of investment has to do with what other people are seeing other people doing, rather than the Hayekian world, in which people have all this information from markets and therefore they can understand what's happening. No. You can't understand what's happening unless you understand human psychology. When I get up in the morning and I look in the mirror, I don't see a rational person. I don't know how many of you do. We carry around this 3 pounds of defective hamburger between our ears, and yet we expect that people with that biological defect are going to make the right decision. And they don't. They don't. And Marx is clear on that in 1856 when Depression comes. He does incredible work. And the people in Mega do equally incredible work. I went to a conference in Japan. They were looking at the notebooks at the time of that Depression. And these people were so thorough that they would look at all the clippings in Marx's notebooks, and they would figure out from the font what newspaper printed it, and then they would go back and figure out what day and what page it was on. Incredible research. However, we shouldn't give them too much credence because they never figured out the law of the falling rate of profit. I won't take too much time.
That's okay, you're going great.
I'm having fun. This is fun. It's like teaching a class where no one falls asleep. We're working out. Okay, so people want to look for some sort of certainty in Marx. And like the painting I started with, there's so much there. It entails a real sensitivity, looking at all the possibilities, looking at all the options. The only one who's really carried anything through like that with the Engels, because he helped with all this stuff. Marx is, what's really interesting is I told you about this Depression 1873. Just a few years before that, say 12 years before that, Marx is writing a description of how capitalism works, and it's almost an accurate reading of what was going to happen in a decade or so. How he was able to see all this happening, how he was able to understand that, is beyond me. But then, as his mother said famously, you know what I'm going to say? Say it. Speak up. You have to speak up. It's very bad to not speak up. What did his mother say?
Instead of writing about money, you should have made some.
No. You shouldn't have written about capital. You should have earned it. Incidentally, if anyone's really interested in Marx, there's a wonderful book out called Love and Capital.
Yes.
I think that's terrific. Okay, that's for me to sit down.
I'm going to try to give yet another perspective on Marx's law of motion. As you may know, before 1980, I was one of the 3 people called Dr. Doom warning about the debt crisis. But then my friends at Drexel Burnham convinced me that the debt, I'd be a premature fascist to warn about this, because the debt was just about to take off because of one of their guys, Michael Milken, developing junk bonds. So I thought, what am I going to do for the next 10 years if I can't write about, I don't want to, warn about that we can't pay our debts when everybody's getting rich off it. So I became an anthropologist with the Peabody Museum working on antiquity, and I started with what I thought were Marx's big laws of motion. And that's the sequence of modes of production from the ancient mode of production, which was usury and slavery. I was especially interested in usury, into feudalism. And then he realized that, as you know, from feudalism into capitalism, and Marx realized that capitalism was radical. Capitalism was revolutionary. Its task was to free society from the carryovers of feudalism, from land rent, from usury banking. And he noticed feudalism was radical. If the ancient mode of production, as defined by Marx, was usury and slavery, then feudalism's job, number one, you freed the slaves. They weren't slaves. They could no longer living in the segregated barracks that you had at the end of the Roman Empire. They could have families, and they could live as serfs. And you had the Christian church banning usury, except when practiced by the Christian church, the Knights Templar, etc. So feudalism was revolutionary. It moved beyond the ancient mode. Capitalism was revolutionary because its task, certainly in 1848, was to free capitalism from the rentiers, from the idle rich. And then socialism was developing out of capitalism, out of the working class, which is revolutionary because it wanted to free wage labor to recover the means of production for the labor that produced it. So the long law of motion to Marx is how one system changed to another. This is why economists hate Marx. All economics since Marx has been basically a denial of any laws of motion. The whole idea is that I remember when I went to NYU for my PhD, there was a business cycle class, and in the business cycle we were told, I don't know if this one, Schumpeter's business cycle, it's a smooth sine curve moving like this, back and forth, all along. Now, if you notice, let's just take this part. The sine curve here, it's an S curve. This is an S curve that turns down. And almost any National Bureau of Economic Research chart of the U.S. economy shows the up and down. But then, and Marx talked about this. I gave my talk in, I think, for the graduate school in Marxist Theories of Business Cycles. My teacher, a German refugee, said, "Don't let the rest of the university know you're talking about this." Because I talked, first of all, you had Marx in value throughout Capital, talking about the 11-year business cycle theory. He was really the first to talk about business cycles. And then in volume 3, he talked about finance saying that this is an economic business cycle, but finance has its own mathematical growth, and it's a purely exponential growth. And you have all this area here, the tendency of financial claims on the economy grows faster than the economy can grow. Now that's especially since Michael mentioned obsolescence. Marx really developed a theory of obsolescence that had not been voiced before that time. So you have Marx in volume 3 giving a financial result of crises. Now, if you look at modern business cycle theory, basically, they it was developed by Wesley Mitchell at Columbia University, who would throw all of the statistical time series that he could have into a computer and see, well, what's leading, what's lagging, and how do we have this automatic recovery? And it's called automatic stabilizers. And 50 years ago, when I was in school, economics is all about how these automatic stabilizers keep restoring the economy to equilibrium. Equilibrium means the starting point. What was before? Equilibrium is the starting point of a perfect economy where everybody gets what they deserve in proportion to their productivity. And the best definition, Marxist definition of productivity I can think of is Lloyd Blankfein of Goldman Sachs. And he said, the Goldman Sachs partners are the most productive workers in the world because we make more than anybody else. And that's productivity in the national accounts. How do you, it's easy to measure productivity for manufacturing and for goods and service, for producing products, because here's output per man hour, the number of cars and the number of men. How do you calculate productivity for services? The American National Income Account, followed all over the world, defines productivity as the amount that you earn per hour. Regardless of how, because they say, how else do you define a service? Well, if Goldman Sachs is productive by taking money out of the rest of the economy, what's called a zero-sum game, where one person's gain is another's loss, that's counted as productivity. And you have since, I guess I should say since, let's say, 1980, the economy sort of growing like this, all of this growth has accrued, as you know, to the 1%. That's called the Great Moderation. The moderation is when the 99% don't get any more and are absolutely stable, and all the growth goes to the 1%, mainly in the financial sector. Well, you can imagine why people don't want to study Marx when it comes to an alternative view, and they give Nobel Prizes for showing the mathematics. Michael poked fun at trying to mathematize Marx. Probably the worst example of trivializing Marx is Paul Samuelson's article, where he said, look, I finally expressed Marx in mathematical terms, and you really can't, you want to find out the silliness of mathematical economics, Paul Samuelson's article is probably the best you can think of. So basically, the whole idea of modern economics is there isn't going to be any change. It's called the institutional environment, meaning the political and social environment remains constant. And if there is a political change, economists have a word for it, exogenous, meaning not our department. It's external to the model. So Marx put politics as the very center of his model, and the definition of economics today is you don't consider what Marx considered. No wonder they hate Marx. No wonder there's a definition. And I guess that's why they've given us such a small room here. It's offensive to to many parts of the status quo. So in volume 1, Marx talked about what, as Bertell was saying, about the internal contradictions of capitalism as a means of mode of production process. In volume 3, he talked about rent and about finance capital growing exponentially, and he was very clear in saying that we're talking about, just as Bertell said, a system. And he said, in the system, the industrial economy of wage labor and paying the population wages to buy the products, that's one set of dynamics. But on the other hand, we have this carryover from feudalism, this financial banking, unproductive lending, and it grows purely by mathematical laws that have nothing to do with the economy. He said they were autonomous mathematical laws of compound interest, and more than anyone else of his time, Marx collected all of the what previous writers had written on compound interest. So if you're a Lutheran, probably not many here, but the only place you can read what Martin Luther wrote about interest is not in his complete works, that are published by Fortress Press. The only place is in the footnotes to volume 3 of Capital, and Theories of Surplus Value. Even the Lutherans will exclude this. And Marx wrote about, he always denounced Malthus for being a plagiarist of Reverend Richard Price, who drew the contrast between compound and simple interest. Simple interest grows very slowly, but compound interest, you'd have, if a penny saved at the time of Jesus grew at 5% interest, the person would have a solid sphere of gold going all the way out to the orbit of Saturn. So Marx picked this up and applied it to the population. And when Malthus's idea of population, contrasting the allegedly exponential growth of people, poor people, to the growth of food, the population was already familiar with the distinction between compound and simple interest, because this was the central argument of the day since 1776. Not Adam Smith, but Richard Price, and the whole argument over, how to pay off Britain's public debt. The only place you get a discussion of this history is really in Marx, and in fact, it's also only in Marx's writing that you get an economic discussion of ancient Greece and Rome. Everybody was discussing politically, and Marx was the only person to discuss Greece and Rome. And that was just as traumatic. A few years ago in Germany, there's a very famous book that's quoted everywhere, listing 210 reasons for the collapse of the Roman Empire. Lead piping, homosexuality, Christianity. The one thing that is not cited is that what every Roman historian, Livy, Plutarch, all the rest cited, that was creditor rule, creditor-debtor relations. Marx wrote about this, and he said the same. The role of capitalism is to free society from this, and Marx, as you know, followed. Engels wrote that Marx always admired the French theoretician Saint-Simon, who thought that banks should make equity loans. You don't make a money loan because if business turns down, the lender, the borrower goes broke and the creditor forecloses. He said you have to have a harmony of interest between the lender and the creditor by equity positions, and that's what the Credit Mobilier did in France, and it's what the Reichsbank and the large German banks did in taking equity positions in the industrial companies that they funded. And Marx expected capitalism to follow what was the most advanced capitalist country of his time, which was Germany. And it seemed logical that the German mode of production would overtake what he called the English mode of production, and what the English themselves said was the English sort of hit-and-run mode of production. So one of the laws of motion of Marx is this conflict between the real, what's called the real economy, the production economy, labor and capital, compared to the rentier economy, the finance and the landlords. And Marx pointed out that the role of the 1848 revolution was really a bourgeois revolution to free society. They attacked the landed interest, they attacked the banks, but they stopped there. And Marx said, that's the problem with the bourgeois revolution. They stop by freeing the bourgeoisie, but the bourgeoisie has very little interest in the welfare of the working class, and that's going to be the next revolution, the socialist revolution, and that is what is going to happen, and it's probably going to happen as a result of the repeated crashes. And in Marxist journalism, he would trace the crashes to most of this. This is not the modern theory of business cycles that you'd be taught in business cycle theory. There was a cumulative effect, and the effect was as a system, and I think it was Marx's combination of Marx's looking at the economy as a system and his sense of irony, or internal contradiction, that makes him so popular to his followers. And what leaves the rest of the economics, which he'd call bourgeois economics, basically as junk economics. And in fact, in 2 months, I'll be publishing a book, J is for Junk Economics, going over all of how economic theory has become a kind of euphemism describing all of this. So what we're having today is a constant, in my analysis, is a constant buildup of debt. What the cycle theory doesn't show is that each business cycle in America is taken off from a higher and higher level of debt to national income, of debt to family income, of debt to corporate income, and of debt to government income. And I think we finally reached the limit. And I think we're in now what used to be called the final crisis. The final crisis is a systemic crisis when the environment can't continue along the laws that it's been doing. It can't restore the status quo ante, because there's only one way to restore equilibrium, and it's not a self-stabilizing automatic stabilizer. If the problem is the growth of debt, taking more and more of personal income for mortgage debt, for student loans, for bank loans, and for credit card debt, the only way that you can restore equilibrium is to wipe out the debt to the financial class. Well, you had the 1848 revolutions largely against the landlord class. You had John Stuart Mill and the whole rest of the 19th century fighting against landlordism, but increasingly on a purely libertarian scale. The idea was, yes, we don't want landlords, but we don't want government. And somehow the fight against landlords became a fight against the governments dominated by landlords, because they dominated the House of Lords. And in England, for instance, there was a constitutional crisis in 1909 when the Parliament finally enacted a revenue bill for a land tax to collect all the land rent from the landlord class, and the House of Lords rejected it. And the constitutional crisis lasted until 1910, when Britain passed a law that the House of Lords could never again overrule a revenue act by the House of Commons. But it was already too late, because by then World War I was looming, and World War I untracked history. Instead of leading the world along the German lines, which were increasingly social democratic lines, and also where banking was indeed industrialized, as Marx had expected, you had the wrong side winning. Basically, you had the Americans essentially winning as creditors, and the result was that the rules of finance became creditor-oriented, largely because of the inter-allied debts. which had to be paid, and the only way the Allies could pay was to get reparations from Germany, and the only way Germany could repay was to borrow money from Wall Street by its small municipalities. So you had a flow, you had the Federal Reserve in America holding down interest rates, just like today, to promote an outflow of American loans to Germany, German municipalities, that turned the dollars over to the Reichsbank, that paid the dollars over to France and England to repay the inter-allied debts to the United States. So you had a circular flow, but this circular flow entailed, again, debts rising and rising until you had another 1929, and that led to a kind of crisis where, well, you didn't have socialism out of it, but at least you got the New Deal and anything to postpone real kind of socialism. I think we're in a similar kind of crisis today, and so we're back to, I think, what Bertell said. There's also the law of anarchy is one of these laws of motion, and everything's up for grab. So the question is, where are these laws of motion leading today? Well, I think if you're having a rising impact of debt on a national economy, the country to look at as a model is Greece. I often take Latvia, but you're probably more familiar with Greece, so we'll use that. A country that owes more money than it can possibly pay. What's going to happen? Well, the IMF and the Germans say, well, you have to pay the debts. You're going to have to do what the Germans did after World War I. You're going to have to borrow the money, but you can't borrow the money because nobody's going to lend to Greece anymore, because the IMF won't lend it the money to pay the bondholders. So they have to sell off the property. So we're in a process of rolling back capitalism and rolling back even feudalism. We're rolling back the public investment of property, rolling back public ownership of the commons, of the basic public utilities, of the roads, the land, the government, the ports, everything that had been in the public sector all the way from the temples and palaces of Mesopotamia. We're rolling them back, and we're actually going back to, what would you call it? Well, you could call it neo-feudalism, because we're going back to pretty much what Marx was describing in feudalism. And it's a result of foreclosures. We're into foreclosure time now, and what's happening in Greece is a kind of voluntary foreclosure. In other words, as long as Greece agrees to remain in the Eurozone and remain in the Western monetary system of the IMF and the World Bank and NATO, it's going to continue to shrink and have an exodus of labor and emigration. You're having privatization on a national scale. You're having a return of the control of government from the democratic government back to oligarchic government. The whole fight of Ricardo and the land reformers in the 19th century, the progressives were to extend the vote to empower the House of Commons to overcome the House of Lords. The idea was that if you could promote democracy, as you're having in Germany and America, the idea, and obviously it's a silly idea we know now, the idea was that people would vote in their own self-interest. And the idea was, when they did it, they'd vote in their own economic self-interest. And that would reform, and the democratic reform would certainly begin to cure the problem of the idle rich, to cure the problem of unearned income. And all that's very cleverly being rolled back today, not only by Citizens United, but by the tactics of the oligarchy to have people vote on identity other than their class interest. So you have, as I mentioned in the talk the other day, you have the National Association of Women for Wall Street, National Association of LGBT for Wall Street, headed by a Wall Street billionaire, just as the National Association of Women, run by a right-wing Wall Street billionaire. You have all of these identity politics, all run by Wall Street lobbyists, essentially, trying to convince people that their identity is other than a class identity. Now, this is what Bertell's talked about very often. People like my editors at, when I am doing something in the public press, like Washington Post a little while ago, and I put in working class, they all correct, no, middle class. They like to call themselves middle class. It's like you don't call the blacks certain names, you don't use the word working class for people who would take offense at it. So the idea is to make them think that they're capitalists in miniature, and that's Margaret Thatcher's labor capitalism. Let all the workers who use telephones, let them buy shares in British Telephone. Offered it one half the price that it'll sell an hour after issue, and 1/10 the price it'll sell next week. You can make money. You see how easy it is? We're going to sell you as a subscriber British Telephone shares. Hope you made a killing in the market. Oh, sorry, you lost your job. But think of, if you think of yourself as a capitalism, you see that's how you get ahead. Working, not good. And that basically is Thatcherism taken over from Pinochet. Well, that's what's happening today. We're having a rollback. The degree to which workers and voters and wage earners, as Marx would say, think of themselves as capitalists in miniature and maybe landlords in miniature making a killing on their house, as when Margaret Thatcher privatized the council housing. The effect of privatizing council housing is that Londoners cannot live in London anymore to go to work. They have to move way outside of London and travel in on privatized railways. Those prices are much higher running on privatized tracks that have the usual amount of accidents because safety impairs profits. And as Milton Friedman said, the job of a corporation is to make profit. So essentially, we're moving back not only toward the feudal mode of production, but what Marx called the ancient mode of production, usury and slavery. Now, the difference, of course, is that it's not the kind of slavery you had either in antiquity or feudalism. Under feudalism, the slaves were able to have families and have their own plot, but they couldn't leave the land. Their labor belonged to the lord. The landlord at that time in terms of labor days. Now workers can move wherever they want, but they have to, if they want to have their own security of a home, they have to take out a mortgage. And the mortgage, the federal government in this country guarantees home mortgages up to 43% of the borrower's income. So if the worker pays 43% of their income, let's say for the home mortgage, about 10% for student loans, because you need to get a degree in order to get a job, in order to qualify for taking out a mortgage. And then maybe another 10% for auto loan and for credit card debt, so you can just feed yourself. Well, you're already up to about 60%, and then 15% of your salaries withheld for wages, withheld for pre-saving for health care and Social Security to produce enough of a surplus so that the tax rate on the upper 90% can be cut and the budget can be balanced. Then obviously what you're having is debt slavery or debt peonage instead of feudalism. So I think you can look at Marx's laws of motion in the big sense is a huge grand circle, and what we're seeing is not progress, but we're seeing really what the ancient concept of time was. The very Western idea is that progress is only upwards, but in antiquity they all had the circular return, a kind of renewal of time, and this was Mesopotamia, Egypt. My old teacher at Chicago wrote Mircea Eliade wrote a book on the myth of the eternal return, but he didn't talk about debt. And the whole point of the eternal return in Mesopotamia was when any new ruler would take the throne, the first thing they do would proclaim a clean slate. You wipe out the debt so you can begin again. That was the ancient business cycle, and it worked. That's the only way you can restore the status quo ante. The only way you can restore equilibrium is for government operating from outside the economic system. That's why economists don't talk about it. And that's the problem in economics, and that's the difference between the Marxist laws of motion and the economist laws of non-motion. Yeah, the 11-year cycle. Yes. He said, Engels? Engels told Marx he was off the rails,
Exactly.
and you wrote the book. What was your book, Railroading? Yes.
But no, I didn't.
Uh-huh.
What about the Condorcet cycle?
That turns out, we looked at that years ago. That's really a 50-year cycle, and it's a war cycle. Wars always give birth to debts. Adam Smith, book 5 of The Wealth of Nations, made a big point saying that governments should finance wars by taxing so that people feel their immediacy just while we're fighting them, and then they won't go to war and there won't be a public debt. But the countries have not followed his advice. Wars are financed by debt, and they leave a legacy of debt. So there's been a war about every 50 years, and that turns out to have been the Kondratiev cycle.
I want to state this as briefly as I can and tie together what Michael Perelman said earlier and what you just said. While it's true that in many respects there is no law of the rate of falling profit in volume 1 of Capital, and there are tendencies, should we not forget about the fact that Marx is writing this at the beginning of the last phase of capitalist development, which is monopoly finance capital, and that the tendencies that he sees could be determined as a law of motion later on when that formation of capital is more advanced. So, for example, in 1934, when Lewis Corey publishes The Decline of American Capitalism, he very clearly and methodically looks at the rate of falling profit within the production of capital goods, and then goes on to explain why the rate of falling profit in capital goods then leads to speculation after 1926, 27. So I want to point that out. And if that's true, then I would take issue with what Michael Hudson is saying, is that as an historian, I cannot see the return to neo-feudalism, because to me that is totally ahistorical. Capitalism has a history of its own, and all the symptoms that you articulated about what is present in capitalism today, I would say these are properties and functions of finance capital. So oddly enough, in 1935, when the Comintern, who is the Seventh Congress of the Comintern? The name escapes me. Dimitrov, yeah. When Dimitrov says fascism is the power of finance capital itself, I mean, that is a prescient remark in many ways, because what Dimitrov was describing as fascism in Germany and the totalitarian form of capital in Germany is basically, I think, everything that you described here. And I take issue with what you're saying is because I'm an historian. I started out as a medieval historian. So everything that you said is quite familiar to me. But at the same time, I find it very difficult to accept the fact that we're rolling back. The rollback that you've described, these are all functions of finance capital. And Marx.
I see something different than exactly a rollback of what we have. What's happened now is finance has taken over what should be the productive sector of the economy. So if you're a CEO now, you have to be sure that the hedge funds don't come after you. You have to be sure that you keep the stock high, and you do that by buying back stock, buying other companies to reduce competition. Nothing is being done, virtually nothing, in terms of productive investment in the U.S. So it's going to come into some kind of crash. Whether it will be a crash of war because we're having trouble at home, or whether it will be an economic crash, but we're not doing anything to make a healthy economy. It's capitalism devouring itself through finance.
At issue is, where is finance capitalism leading? If you would have asked Marx, he'd think, well, finance capital is leading into its merging with industrial capital, and but it's going to be subordinate to industrial capital, because that's what industrial capitalism does. It subordinates all these pre-existing modes of production to its laws of motion. But instead of finance being industrialized, industry is being financialized, as Michael's just said. So the question is, this is something that Marx would not have expected. He thought that history was going to go forward and capitalism was going to move towards socialism, but it's not moving towards socialism. And if it's not moving towards socialism, where is it moving? Bertell often says, well, it's moving towards barbarism. You can call it fascism or barbarism, but it's certainly not leading towards socialism, and it's not part of the industrial process, because when finance capital takes over a firm, it's downsizing, it's outsourcing. Its way of making money is a bubble economy, using a debt leveraging to increase the price of stocks and bonds and bank loans, and this is not real wealth. This is not tangible wealth. This is not a means of production. Stocks, bonds, and bank loans are not means of production. They're financial claims on production. And as Frederick Soddy pointed out, he won a Nobel Prize, but not for economics. It was for chemistry. The exponential growth of finance overcomes the ability of the economy to produce a surplus and to pay the debts. And that's the problem we're in. And that dynamic structurally has a closer kinship both to feudalism and to the ancient mode of production than it does to industrial capitalism. So industrial capitalism failed in the revolutionary task that Marx set for it, which was to free itself from these earlier modes of production. It's ended up not freeing itself and being overcome by these earlier modes.
I'd like to say a word on the difference between laws of motion and tendencies. There are no differences. There are no differences. Marx says in a couple of places, by law, he means tendency.
Right.
And you find in Marxism a discussion of a few pages, I forget which of the volumes of it appears in, post-capital, where he gives you a whole series of what he calls counter-tendencies, which is a way of showing that these tendencies are sometimes stronger than they are than other times, and when they are, the word law is more appropriate, and when they're not, tendency is the word tendency, and that suggests, of course, that other outcomes can come about from what seems to be a tendency. And what we've had today is clearly some outcomes which are different than the ones that Marx thought were most likely to come about, certainly by the time in which we're living and talking here today. So I think this is the way to look at this. And then, of course, if it is, the outcome is different than what Marx expected, I think more than one of the different ways of labeling it, of the language used to discuss it, is appropriate, depending on what aspect of what is occurring and being developed we want to emphasize. So I don't see that much difference in terms of what is meant by the different labels that people want to give to what's happening in our period.
Chris, you then you.
This is a question for Bertell. Bertell, you spent a fair amount of time laying out the various laws of motion and that govern the development and trajectory of the capitalist system. Could you, sort of as an empirical exercise, briefly sketch how the interaction of the various laws of motion can explain the particularity of the crisis that we're in now?
Well, that's a question which could only be answered not by a book, but several volumes. But I will mention one very important part of such an answer, and that would be the relationship between what's going on in capitalism in general and in modern version of capitalism, and in relation to what's going on in not the 5 levels that Marx talked about, but a 6th one, which he mentioned a few times, but didn't really write about, and that is nature. That is nature. And I'm talking about the interaction that's going on between the way capitalism is conducting itself now, globally and what's happening to the natural world, climate change, and all the side effects of climate change. That there you find two laws of motion that come onto these different levels, which are in contradiction, and one of them is suffering, enormously and about to cause an enormous effect on the laws of motion of those levels where there are human beings living and need a certain minimum quality to the natural world in which they live in order to survive. And that would be a good example about how, after breaking things down in the way I have, you have to spend some time also seeing the relation between these laws of motion in order to get an adequate understanding of, especially of what's happening to nature, but also to see how it's capitalism as capitalism, which is most responsible for what's going on in the areas of the natural world. And therefore, if the species comes to an end, it's going to be from an area that Marx didn't give enough attention to, but we can and must. But the solution to dealing with it is getting rid of capitalism. And nothing short of that is going to, save us from all the problems which come with climate change.
I want to take you quickly one thing. Marx did really interesting stuff on environmentalism.
Well, I didn't consider.
He called the current forestry a hidden socialist tendency.
The hidden what?
Socialist tendency.
He called the hidden what?
He called what was going on in forestry.
In forestry.
Was a hidden socialist tendency.
Okay.
He also changed the idea of value theory. He said all value depends upon reproduction costs, not production. We puts him right in the heart of environmentalism. At one point, he talked about 3 significant agronomists, and he said they have more to say than all the economists put together. He was probably the first real environmental economist.
So, question then. That paper by,
Sorry.
I thought you were done, I'm sorry.
Okay.
Okay, it was a paper by Wynne Godley, 7 irreproducible processes, probably right at once upon a time came from the Levy Institute. And I found that fascinating because it really came down to the question of something that can't go on forever. Well, you illustrate something that can't go on forever in terms of the spread between financial weight on the economy and its productive outcomes. So the one thing that I think those perspectives have that the mainstream economists don't is the possibility of prognosticating. Not you're going to have a crystal ball that says, sell all your equities today. No, I did that once and did very well as a result. But what in the relative near term should we then be expecting? Are we facing another Great Depression?
I should elaborate what he's saying. Wynne Godley was one of the group of people that have led to what's called modern monetary theory. It's the theory that's taught at the university I'm associated with, the University of Missouri at Kansas City, and also with the Levy Institute. Most of this was developed by a Marxist, by Hyman Minsky. And they get a little embarrassed because the Levy Institute's named for a Wall Street raider, right-winger, and he didn't want Minsky to mention Marx very much. But the fact is that Minsky gave all those kids Marx to read, and that all of us, we call ourselves heterodox economists because it's much nicer than calling ourselves Marxists. But basically, the reason that we're denounced by thugs like Paul Krugman and other people who pretend to be on the left is their visceral hatred for us is precisely because we're progressive, and that he calls modern monetary theory or heterodox economy a cult. He's tried to do everything to block what we've done everywhere, and what we have to say there, it's really incompatible between our financial analysis that that finance is tearing the economy apart. What we're saying is incompatible with everything they give the Nobel Prize for, with the with the neoclassical economics of Krugman, who my department head calls Thugman, and the others. And I met Krugman once. We were in Russia, And I was, we were sort of in a dining room, and I was sitting at one table, and Perelman saw and went to another table and sat down and muttered to himself. We were on the same podium, and his eyes didn't meet me once. I can't tell you the visceral hatred and fear that economists have when you begin talking about disequilibrium. It's as if they feel guilty. It's as if they're going to fall over. Although others will simply foam at the mouth. There's a real there's a mode of thinking. Either people, and I think one CIA person at the Ford Foundation once explained it to me, that people who think about change really want it to change. And people who think about everything being in equilibrium, they don't want it to change. They're the people we like. And that's really it in a nutshell.
So, crystal ball, though.
Crystal ball?
Great Depression coming?
I don't see any way out of it until there's until people decide that until the debts are written down. There's no way in which people or the Greek government or the American family or debt-ridden industrial corporations can pay their debts and not shrink. Walk down, any of you who are out of town, walk down 8th Street, which was the central business street of Greenwich Village. For years, half the stores are closed.
Soho.
Yeah, Soho. Yeah, and Broadway. Take a walk and look at all of the closed commercial stores. They're out of business because people cannot afford to pay all the debts they've taken and buy things. So people are talking about a crash in the commercial rental market soon. There's a little bit of a bubble in commercial. People are jumping out of bonds. What are they going to put it in? If interest rates go up, you're going to lose money in the bonds, so you're putting it in real estate. That'll push it up beyond the ability of the rents to pay the mortgage. And it's very much like what Michael described for obsolescence of a company, that all of a sudden you have an innovating company come in producing more cheaply. The company can't pay its debts. There's a collapse. Well, there's a lot of real estate that is still over-indebted and a lot of firms that are over-indebted, and entire countries, not only Greece, but Portugal, Italy, Spain, they're all talking about just a breakup now. And the Federal Reserve's policy is a zero interest, is to save matters by saying, okay, we'll loosen the credit terms. We won't cancel the debts, but we're going to lower the interest rate to just about zero, and we'll stretch out the maturity. But now that they're doing that, that's led the pension funds to go bankrupt, to go into deficit. It's led the insurance companies not to be able to invest and make a profit unless they give their money to hedge fund managers that quickly empty out their pockets. And so there's no solution that you can see that doesn't make things worse. So this is as good as it gets.
I would also suspect that at this point, Bertell might move in and say, even with the necessary debts removed, if the capitalists or the 1% are still dissociated, the sense of alienation has permeated all globally, and the worker is voting against herself, then that's it. Then there is nothing other than what Bertell is apparently saying yesterday and today, that there's really no answer. The dynamic of alienation hitting not only the 1%, they're dissociated, and then the worker is, even with what you're suggesting, it looks, I don't know, is there any thought?
Yeah.
I think there are few possibilities for the future, but but that future is still determined by what are the conditions in the present and the past pushing in a certain direction, because that direction in which it's pushing in can move and quickly become 2 and even 3 different directions. Rosa Luxemburg's Socialism and Barbarism was one attempt to do so, but now we have to add fascism, or fascism could be a period on the way to barbarism. One possibility is still some form of socialism, because changes, when they come, can come pretty quickly, including changes in consciousness. And therefore, it pays to continue the struggle. I don't think it's not time yet to give up. But certainly the various possibilities of a non-socialist kind seem to be a bit stronger, and not only because Trump's going to probably be our next president, but in various places. And I think we need to continue to try to focus much more than I think people on the left have in recent years on raising class consciousness. I don't think the social movements, as good as they are in terms of their choice of important issues, and as important as it is to improve people's lives in the different areas where they're active, I don't think that they've done us a favor by getting too many people on the left to downplay or even to ignore people's interests as members of a class, including people who are also members of that class, the working class. But it's only the working class because of their numbers. The greatest strength of the working class has always been in their numbers, because Marx, who did talk about productive labor and unproductive labor and had, for certain problems, divided the working class, so it seems considerably less than 50% of the population. It was already in his day the great majority of the population, and this is how he often talked about the workers as the majority. And it couldn't be then only productive workers he had in mind. He's talking about everybody who needs to find a job in order to make enough money to live. Okay, and that really does come close, if not to the 99%, pretty much to the 95 and 96% of the population in most of the countries of the world. And it's only when they manage to see, and they're seeing it in the crisis, because nothing is 100% bad or good, and in the crisis with all the problems associated with it, it does sort of, as Buffett, the sage of Omaha, said, when the tide recedes from the ocean, you can see who's swimming naked. The crisis offers people a kind of tide in their lives, where they lose their job, or at least job security, work overtime without getting paid for it, can't pay their rent, can't have a car, they can't pay for their kids in college. This gets people to think about who they are, and it starts with thinking about who you are, and then see who else is out there who is part of that group that you're in. And that might be not the middle class, which is the big way in which this has been covered up for most people, certainly in America, and begin to think more in terms of what would be in the interest of that class in the present situation. So and I think an important step in that direction is finally getting together in a mass party of the working class. I'm not against a party, as too many people in the social movements are, but I don't find any party there which I want to join for various reasons. But the point is this, I think still that, and Marx was always interested in a class being there along with trade unions, along with other kinds of organizations which are doing important work, helping in their way to raise class consciousness, and not just the consciousness of one sector of the population with a special grievance. Although we have to become more conscious of those grievances so we can draw people who are doing that into a mass movement, which is essentially a working class movement with working class interests, and develop the kind of class consciousness among that group to make the move into the kind of revolutionary change which we need, which is our only hope, because sooner or later, with even the reforms, which are good reforms, the kind Bernie Sanders wants to make, I'm not against those reforms. At the same time, those reforms are not going to change all those parts of the law of motion of our society which are going to drive us over the edge with the climate, with fascism, with a number of other things which bode. I don't want to go into the dark side of this.
Whenever Bertell and I talk together, he always reminds me not to sound like an 1848er. When we were in China at the School of Marxist Studies last fall, he urges me to remind the audience that even if we cure all the problems of finance, capitalism, and finance and landlords, we're still going to have the post-1848 problem. We're still going to have the problem of capitalism. So just freeing capitalism from feudalism is not socialism. That's still, all that does is free capitalism to have the problems that led to socialism. So what I've been focusing on is the detour that capitalism has taken, and Bertell correctly always reminds me, remember, there's always this door. Yes.
Yeah, well, in some ways, it's very, very important, I think, to get a sense of these detours and the very perilous situation that we're facing, which all three speakers were addressing. But I hope you won't feel that I'm being threatening. If I pose a perspective that's coming from a little bit, to steal a line from Sojourner Truth, coming from a different field. And that is the question that it seems very hard for me to think about the contemporary crisis of capitalism, especially in America, disassociated from the problematic of race and racism, because in the history of the United States, and ever more so the history of contemporary America, class relations and economic formations are shaped by racial determinations. That's been something Marx certainly understood. Labor and the whiteskins can't be emancipated so long as labor and the black is branded, et cetera, et cetera. So in other words, the constitution of the economic and class formations that constitute contemporary capitalism, we're seeing this in Europe as well, are racially overdetermined. And they are not simply phenomenal after effects of the class formations, but they in fact inform those class relations, shape them in certain directions. Why I'm raising this is because in terms of trying to think about ways out and alternatives to this, the one thing I'm sure everybody in this room will agree upon, I hope, okay, is the one most promising thing that we've seen in this country in the last several years is what? A new generation of young activists fighting racism. I would contest the claim, whether it's Black Lives Matter, or dozens of other groups, Black Youth Project, or Shada's Daughters, whatever you want to pick, or the different protests or movements, I would contest the claim that this is simply a repeat of identity politics of old that's diverting us from the fundamental issues. I think that itself, that claim has to be subject to some critical dialectical scrutiny, because it's from that we may very well see a kind of a catalyst towards a renewal of trying to get to the root of the logic of capital and challenge it precisely through the arena in which the capital relation finds its dehumanization most vividly expressed, which is in the racialism and the racial categories that define U.S. society today.
Okay, I think I know at 3 o'clock there's a meeting in the big auditorium on precisely that issue. So obviously,
and in this room at 3:30.
3:30. Right, yeah, precisely that issue. Someone over there.
Let me just say one sentence answer to that. I hope you're right, because how can I not? But I'm not convinced.
You want to say a little bit of why?
Yeah.
Well, because I don't see it yet from what I've read and heard and in discussions with various people involved in some of those movements. It doesn't come out to me that clear yet, although that there is a potential for that, I wouldn't deny.
I was beginning to think you were purposely keeping this side. Like, it's good. I'm sorry.
Okay, we'll go to that thing. Huh?
So I just wanted to ask the panel, with everything that's described here, has reached the point of economics becoming irrational. Now the system no longer serves human needs. So when it reaches that point, what are your personal politics of what the working class needs? I heard about Revolutionary Party. I'm of a contingent that definitely believes that the working class needs an independent party that serves its interests with revolutionary leadership. So what are your personal politics? Where do you see that leadership coming from, if you do at all? And I just also want to make just a brief comment when the gentleman said, it was like a small comment, but you said that for black people, like certain words, and for the working class, they want to say middle class. The fact that we can't say the N-word, where you can't say middle class, just kind of shows, I just wanted there to be a little sensitivity to that still. Thank
Wait, did I say something insensitive?
No, no, but no, I'm not trying to be PC here, but it's just,
I know what you're saying. You're right. Regarding the political party, I guess I'm on the same boat with Bertell. I'm not sure we would want to be members of any party that would let us in. Because we're not the corporate types. I don't know of any party. If there were, we'd certainly join it. Just like I really don't know, for years I stopped teaching. I didn't know of any school. You talked about dysfunctional economics. It was dysfunctional already in the 1890s. The economics profession had a reaction against Marxism. It was called, Veblen called it sort of unfortunately the neoclassical school, and it was really post-classical. It was headed by that awful guy in Columbia University, John Bates Clark, who the American Economic Association gives an annual John Bates Clark Award to the best economist under the age of 40, with best economist meaning proving that everybody gets what they earn and there is no such thing as unearned income. That's the assumption underlying all post-classical, meaning post-Marxist economics. And the whole fight against Adams, the reason that the modern free marketers hate Adam Smith, hate John Stuart Mill, and hate all classical economics was it all led to Marx. And by rejecting Marx, you have to reject the entire development of British political economy, which all led up to him. And so what happened 100 years ago? Well, economists took the lead in forming the American Sociological Association. They said, okay, let's talk about sociology. That at least talks about institutions. And then the University of Chicago did the sociology, what it did to economics, and wrecked that. So people began to go into anthropology. And then the University of Chicago and others sort of sterilized anthropology into kinship patterns and underwater basket weaving. You know, not really the evolution of how civilization took place. So almost every field trying to get an overall economic picture has been sterilized in due course, and that's why I don't know what to call myself. I mean, I'm associated with the Peabody Museum at Harvard, which is their anthropology department, with the economics department in Kansas City, and the School of Marxist Studies in Beijing. I don't know what you'd call all of this. As one of my Russian friends said, Marxism is China's word for politics.
Mannheim would have called you a free-floating intellectual, if there was such a thing.
Oh, did you want to say something?
Yeah. There was also something called the American Economic Association. In the 19th century, if you wanted a good education, you went to Germany. Germany didn't just have a strong economy. It was the fastest growing economy in the world, and they had the best educational system in the world. So all the economists all the great economists went to Germany to study.
When?
In the 19th century.
Late 19th century.
And they studied the same books that Marx studied. And many of them would say, I hate Marx's politics, but his economics makes good sense. It was that sort of thing. However, people like John Bates Clark in the American Economic Association sort of subverted it and became just an ordinary meeting of academics who didn't want to make trouble for anybody except the working class. It's a very sad story. It's a very sad story. But I think one thing that I would say to you is that we on the left have not done a good job of being able to talk to people without talking down to people. We have a very hard time messaging. One of the things Donald Trump does for all his awful whatevers is he has the ability to talk to people's emotions. And some of those emotions are appropriate, like the anger at the way the system's set up. He himself is not a radical by any stretch of the imagination, but his ability to communicate with people is very surprising, but I think it has something to teach us of how to talk to people, how to not be, I'm a PhD, I'm smarter than you are. Listen to how Democrats debate, and they'll just give you numbers and numbers and numbers without talking about emotional things.
No, we don't listen.
Pardon?
We don't listen.
Yeah.
Democrats.
We, the left, we don't listen to the working
I
class.
just wanted to ask a question that you haven't really approached, this idea of Brexit and getting out of the Euro economy, like Greece. I just wanted to have your perspective on, you know, some of the discussions of Greece getting out of the Euro and Britain.
You want to hear what I think of Greece?
Well, anybody on the panel to talk about.
Brexit.
Getting out of the EU.
Well, obviously, the EU was designed essentially by Chicago school monetarists, and the idea was that by creating the euro, and basing the whole, starting the unification around the one organ of government controlled by central banks, which are representative of the commercial banks and the creditors, you've essentially bypassed Parliament. So if you remember, the EU, as it's currently structured, is basically anti-democratic. The policy unit of their junk economics and finance is the cure to pay the debts is austerity. You do what they did in Greece. You lower the you pay the debts by not paying the pensions. You make countries competitive by paying labor so less that it emigrates to other countries, forcing down the price of labor there. The EU is an absolute disaster, and I guess you could say it's all of the worst characteristics of capitalism, but I don't see how that can lead capitalism forward. I don't see how the EU can survive. Probably the weakest point is not England. I bet they're going to vote to stay in because all of the media is for it. I just got back from Austria 2 weeks ago, talking against the transatlantic trade agreement, and to doctors and hospital managers. And they were, a lot of them were shocked. They said, but all of the media says that we're all going to prosper from the trade agreement. They had not heard any argument against it. What I said seemed to be absolutely radical. So the media in Europe are more right-wing than Fox. They're more right-wing on a very hard intellectual level. The politics are much more right-wing. There seems to be no way that you can, it's not reformable. So just as in the 1930s and 40s, the issue was, is the Soviet Union a reformable working state? Is Europe a reformable continent? No, it's a dead zone. It's dying. And the only way you can do is withdraw from it.
So Greece should withdraw from it.
They were hoping, they fear that withdrawal will be even worse because it takes about a year to do the mechanics of the withdrawal. They fear that the immediate response would be a right-wing party. I think Syriza was totally mishandled under Tsipras, and I was working with the left wing of Syriza, and we were all shocked that he knuckled under the way he did, and everybody got very, very discouraged, and their hope was very much like that of Russia after World War I. We've got to hold out until the Germans, Social Democrats, can lead the way to communism. The Greeks said we've got to hold out until the Spanish Podemos and the Italians and the Portuguese come along. I went to Brussels and we tried to get, the Portuguese wanted to come along, but they couldn't get the government to do it. So I think Europe, the Eurozone is unreformable.